Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us, the Prince George's County Sierra Club, for this important conversation about data centers and their impact on our communities. My name is Nicole Jackson. I use she, her pronouns, and I will be your guide and facilitator for tonight's discussion. So, now before we begin, I'd like to take a brief moment to just acknowledge that from where I am, we are gathered on the traditional and unceded lands of the Piscataway people, who, along with formerly enslaved Africans, have stewarded this land for generations. We honor their enduring connection to the land and recognize the importance of environmental justice for all the communities, past, present, and future. Our focus tonight is on data centers. What are they? How they work? The environmental and social impacts that they will bring to our communities. As data centers become more common, we know that we need them to help us advance through technologies. But especially in areas like underserved communities, we want to make sure that it's essential to understand not only the benefits that data centers provide us, but also the challenges that they pose and opportunities that we have to address any solutions that we need in an equitable manner. We are fortunate tonight to have three incredible speakers with us. Dave Arndt with Maryland Legislative Coalition Climate Justice Wing, who will provide us with an introduction and overview on data centers. Kyle Hart from National Parks Conservation Association, who will discuss the broader environmental impacts of data centers. And Paige Westerlink with Sierra Club's Virginia chapter, who will discuss lessons learned from Northern Virginia experiences with data centers. Tonight, we will have a deeper dive into discussions of the issues at hand related to data centers, explore some solutions that prioritize environmental protections and community well-being. And with that said, we will jump right into a dive with our first speaker, Dave Arndt.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for being here. When we look at data centers and what they are, right now, especially in the state of Maryland, we are currently at a rush to approve and build these, and it's a really chaotic and a poorly planned process. But first, we're going to actually look at what data centers are. So, what do data centers really do? They're really you know, incredibly involved in our life as we have it today. We've got a lot of storage that we use, and we use storage for things more than our cat pictures and all of our pictures that we have, but they're for everything that we have on records, like our healthcare, our car maintenance, taxes, you name it, it is stored. Plus, there's a whole lot of big data that is stored out there. One example is I worked at NIH where we stored all the world's sequencing data. And this data is coming in at a gigantic pace every day. And NIH has over 50 petabytes of data, of sequencing data throughout the whole world. And that's just kind of one big example. There's other things like weather data stored by our NOAA and other organizations, or CERN, that really does the experiments over in Europe. All that data is being stored on the internet. We also have data processing applications that we all use, like Google Maps, finding the cheapest flight, using graphical information systems, inquiries to find out what's going on in particular areas, or even like particular search. We all do search every day. There's other things that we do uh, that are providing us information, like video streaming, ordering food online, tracking practices, you name it. You're looking at doing stuff on the internet basically day in and day out. And every time you use your phone or use your computer, you're really using that. And all this data is going through data centers. There's also things that companies do, like email, and of course we all use email too, but companies are using this for that and other applications. And then another kind of hidden part of the data centers is maintaining continuous access. So there's a whole lot of backup data centers. So if one data center goes down, another data center is going to pick up and provide you that data. And those types of things happen instantaneously, where you usually don't notice that. But there's a whole lot of redundancy in at the data centers and the internet. About 2 years ago, AI really started coming on strong with ChatGPT, and that is really kind of, I wouldn't say doubled, but more than doubled what is happening with data centers. It's really vastly increasing our capabilities. However, the size and consumption of everything around data centers is increasing dramatically. And so that means normally data centers were maybe really pretty small, and now they are huge, and they're getting bigger and bigger as more machines, and with more machines, more power is needed to run these data centers. When we look at who are the players out there, there are the data centers that are really driven by AI. So you got Amazon, Microsoft, Google, all the names that you're really probably familiar with. There's some other names out there like Oracle, IBM, Apple, xAI, OpenAI, SAP. There's a lot of companies that really want to be the leaders in AI. And then there's companies that actually own a tremendous amount of data centers that you probably never heard of. So these companies really overall have the most data centers and manage the most data centers, but you probably never heard of them. And they may manage 1,000 data centers around the United States, each of them. And they're running this for companies and other players that need a data center to hold their data. And then there's data center people that all they really are out there for is storage of your data. So you do have Amazon, Microsoft, and Google that store data. So everybody may has a Google Cloud and things like that. But there's other people that store data too, like Dropbox, NetApp, and other companies that are really storing your data so you can retrieve it when you need the data. And then we know it's very popular and getting really kind of where people want to invest when venture capital companies are really getting into this. So they're starting to buy data center farms, getting into it, and just trying to figure out where they can maximize their profit. And then finally, there are some construction companies out there that build hundreds of data centers every year. These are big companies that you probably never heard of. And when we look at this, who's doing what in Maryland, we don't even see any of these companies. So we're still waiting for these companies to really appear in Maryland as building out our data centers. The state of Maryland currently has about 28 data centers that are really tracked. So if you look at the map itself, you'll find in the Baltimore area, there's about 15 data centers. Up by Frederick, there's about 4 of them. Silver Spring has a couple of them. So these are the main data centers that are out there trying to sell their services. There are some other data centers that are in the state of Maryland. So think of some institutions like NIH has its own data center. A lot of the other government organizations have their own data center. NSA, some of the agencies have their data centers. And then the softwares and some software providers have their own data centers that are really kind of private things that they're sharing out to maybe to some people. If we kind of take a look at what these things look like, on the left is a small data center. This is in the state of Maryland. This is sometimes we look at data centers in sizes, sometimes it's square feet, and sometimes it is really how many megawatts of electricity that they use. And a lot of times I like to really explain it more into how many households equivalent of electricity that they really use. So the small one on the left is a 3 megawatt. That is equivalent to about 1,600 households electricity day in and day out. A standard new size data center is about 100 megawatts. That's the same as about 80,000 households. And when we look at data centers coming into Maryland. We know of 11 new proposed ones, and 3 of them are we really call hyper data centers. These are really 1 to 3 gigawatts, which is basically could be 815,000 households to over 2 million households of amount of electricity that they're going to use. And with that comes maybe thousands of diesel generators. Speakers will cover that a little bit later. And then you got diesel storage going along with these diesel generators. So that's really kind of what is happening with the build out of these data centers. And another way to really look at this is how do these data centers compare to everything else that we have in Maryland using electricity? On the left-hand side of the screen, that's just all current Maryland data centers. It's just a little bubble on the screen itself. But when you look at some of the new data centers coming online, like the one in Frederick Quantum Loophole, or the one proposed for PG County, the land Lerner land oversight, those are going to use over 2 gigawatts of power. And when you look at all Maryland households, you'll see that that's a little over 3 gigawatts of power. So if you add Quantum Loophole and Lerner together, they're going to use more electricity than all the households in Maryland. And this is really kind of unique, that's never happened before, is where we got companies coming in using up all this electricity all at one time, versus usually companies coming in are going to be in the small range. The biggest company before that was using electricity was like the Alcoa plant in Frederick, which used about 400 megawatts. So these new data centers are just tremendous power hogs. And then the last thing is, how do they really get built? Well, right now they're currently getting built basically at a local level. State governments make the agreement to build a data center in a county or in a city. And local governments really don't have the tools to really manage this whole thing, and they don't really have the responsibility to manage the whole thing. The Maryland Department of Environment is going to approve diesel generators and construction permits for streams and fuel tanks and things like that, et cetera. And the Public Service Commission is going to approve most of the substations, not all of them, but most of the substations. So when you look at this, all this electric use, you have to have new distribution lines, new transmission lines, and new substations. And that has to be built out. And finally, the Department of Commerce in Maryland is going to approve the data centers, Maryland sales tax and use exemption tax. So they'll approve that at the end to have the companies get a tax rebate or tax credit for building the data center in Maryland. In the bottom part of the screen is just kind of a look at the proposed data centers that we have for Maryland. This is not tracked by any state organization. This is something that has to be developed right now as a grassroots effort. And this is something that we desperately need in Maryland, is really proper tracking so we can understand all the needs and wants of these data centers that are being built. So thank you. That's really kind of it for a description of the data centers.
Wow, thank you, Dave, for such a thorough overview of data centers. So since we are a little bit ahead of schedule, we do have one question in the chat. So I'll ask Naila, actually, if you can come off of mute and go ahead and ask your question.
Sure. Well, this is to all the speakers. I know that there's so much information on this topic, but I wanted to know any social justice data center related books that you think are useful, that maybe are your favorites, that have been published or are recently coming out. And to someone like me who's an avid reader and loves data and research, which ones would you recommend, if any?
Unfortunately, I don't know of any environmental or social justice books written about data centers at this time. I would really point to thinking about like all this electricity that's going to be used and how much it's going to drive up rates. And then you look at the social impacts of rate increases of electricity. I'll turn that over to the other speakers to see if they have any recommendations.
Yeah, I agree with Dave. I plan on talking about this in my section more. Dave really nailed it about the effects on people's rates is going to be pretty significant. But on reading wise, education wise, there's been a lot more media attention on the issue, and a lot of great articles have come out. A lot of great op-eds have come out, at least in Virginia, but I know nationwide too. The New York Times wrote about it recently. And I would recommend just a Google search, and I can also send some articles that I've found helpful your way too, if you're interested.
Thanks, Paige. Kyle, do you have a recommendation or can we move on?
The only thing that I would throw in is the closest thing that I found is long form journalism, sort of like narrative essay on it. And I just included the link to that in the chat, which is sort of the closest thing. And I know the author to this is actually working on a book. And in conversations with her, she's told me that other people are working on books. I think the short answer to this is such a new topic, and books take significant time to be developed. I would look towards books starting to be published on this topic in the next 6 to 12 months.
Thank you. And with that, we are going to go ahead and move on with our next presenter, who happens to be Kyle. So I'll turn it over to Kyle to share his screen.
As Nicole mentioned, my name is Kyle Hart, and I work for a nonprofit called the National Parks Conservation Association, or NPCA. NPCA is the oldest nonprofit dedicated strictly to advocacy on behalf of our nation's national parks. Our nation has, I actually think that number is old. I should probably update it. I think we're up to 431 distinct units of the National Park Service. When people think of national parks, I think rightfully so, people's minds maybe go to Shenandoah or Yellowstone or Yosemite, the Grand Canyon. The National Park Service also manages all kinds of other really awesome resources. The National Mall is managed by the National Park Service, as are National Seashore. So, there's various seashores kind of up and down. Assateague is National Park Service, as well as battlefields and all kinds of other stuff. So really the National Park Service's depth and breadth is nationwide and is not strictly reserved to what a lot of folks think of when they think national parks. And NPCA advocates on behalf of all of those various park sites across the country. As an organization, we are spread out nationwide. We have staff in Alaska and California and Florida and everywhere in between. If there's a park there, we have staff there, or at least have some version of presence there. Sort of at the high level, we advocate for park funding, particularly from Congress. We advocate for the creation of new parks as we seek to understand a fuller picture of the American story to be told by the National Park Service. And we also focus a lot on protecting parks from threats. And that is where this discussion of data centers comes in. You can also learn more in a very simple Google search for npca.org. If you're interested, you can become a member, sign up for emails, take action, the whole 9 yards. So very quickly, this data center discussion really kind of started in the state of Virginia, is, at least from an environmental movement and from NPCA's perspective, in early 2021. Virginia has been building data centers since as early as 2000. One of the things we like to say is that Virginia is the data center capital of the world. This is actually a very old graph. That number, the operational load for data centers in the state of Virginia, is probably pushing 6,000 megawatts at the moment and seemingly grows by the day. So really, at the end of the day, Virginia leads globally the data center market. Dave kind of touched on where Maryland is. Maryland, as you'll kind of see, is not even on this chart, and would be significantly below 500 megawatts. But as you're thinking about this, and I'd like to point out that kind of what Dave was talking about, would put Maryland, Dave had kind of put 6.5 to 7 megawatts as sort of the potential build out currently for Maryland data centers. That would be above this line, so that would be above 5,000 megawatts. Not to give Maryland too much credit, and we're going to get into this, Virginia is currently planning for 50,000 megawatts. So Maryland, if they want to be the data center capital of the world, has some catching up to do. I'm going to make the case tonight that that's maybe not such an aspirational goal, but that's where we're at. So this is just a very quick map that's been pulled together by environmental partners of ours, the Piedmont Environmental Council. Once again, this map is probably 3 or 4 months out of date. You can see generally, though, on this map that data centers are highly clustered in the Northern Virginia region. In particular, there's 3 counties that kind of come to mind as the data center capital of the world. That's Loudoun County, Fairfax County, and Prince William County. But we're starting to see this sort of creep, particularly south and even some west. And so you'll see a couple of already constructed data centers. That's the sort of the lighter pink dot clustered around northern Richmond, and a bunch more sort of starting to creep down the I-95 corridor, Orange County, Culpeper County, and farther south in the state of Virginia. I wanted to kind of touch on like what we're talking about, at least in the state of Virginia, to kind of give a little bit of context. So this is a widely cited number, depending on who you ask in the sort of the inside the data center industry and others. This idea that 70% of the internet traffic runs through Northern Virginia, some people say that's low. Some people say it's closer to 90%. I've heard it's impossible to say. I've heard 50%. Long story short, Virginia has a lot of data centers. There's currently 57 million square feet that are either in operation or under construction at the moment. And then there's another 180 million square feet approved or in the pipeline for approval. I think the current working assumption in the state of Virginia is generally across the board, if a data center is approved, at least at the moment, or if the data center is a proposed plan for it to be approved. Very few projects across the state are getting denied. I've been doing this work for 3.5 years. I think I've seen 2 projects get denied. It's just not happening. When we're talking about this square footage, right? So, you know, it combined significantly over 200 million square feet. Our rough estimate puts that in the realm of 45 gigawatts of power. We have heard from Dominion that they have either signed contracts or load request letters or other versions of, you know, engagement with data center operators and Dominion Energy for as much as 50 gigawatts of power. Now, let's try and grapple with that number for a moment. On a hot summer day at absolute peak power demand, New York City is 10 gigawatts. On an average day, New York City's running around 5 gigawatts. That would more than double the entire sort of load growth or load energy need for the state of Virginia and then some. To put this into perspective from a clean energy perspective, that's about 20 offshore wind farms or 500,000 acres of solar, and that's with no redundancy. So the general mantra in solar is at least 2 to 1. Sometimes some developers are saying as much as 4 to 1 redundancy. So we're looking at a minimum 500,000 acres in solar. To put this into like real world, what does that mean? Shenandoah National Park, you can find it on a map, is 200,000 acres. So we're just to meet data center need in the state of Virginia in clean energy, we're looking at a minimum 500,000 acres or 2.5 Shenandoah National Parks worth of solar. And I like to remind folks, if the state of Virginia builds that much clean energy to meet this demand, we'll have built 500,000 or more acres in solar, and we'll have made 0 progress on our climate goals. That is enough solar to keep us from backsliding. So when you start to think about what this looks like, just start to think about it that way. Now, I think a lot of folks have already started to grapple with what are the environmental impacts of data centers. That rundown kind of started to allude to it, but let's go ahead and really dig in here. So land use impacts in Virginia alone are kind of astronomical, 237 million square feet. That's the equivalent of 1,000 Walmart supercenters. And that's not really counting all the other ancillary infrastructure and needs that come along with data centers. But that would be like in the state of Virginia, if every county in the state of Virginia decided they needed 10 Walmart supercenters, like that's the square footage that we're talking about. That's probably in the area of 10,000 acres of converted land. Now, admittedly, that's not a ton, but I think pretending that that has zero impact on habitat connectivity and stormwater runoff and the like, we'd be fooling ourselves. Like that's a significant impact. And I think more importantly, right now, what we're seeing, which is very frustrating for us, particularly in Virginia, and you're definitely starting to see this in Maryland, particularly in places like Frederick, Maryland, where data center growth is planned for green space. It's not a secret that building on green space is cheaper than redeveloping existing sort of abandoned industrial sites. So what we're starting to see kind of across the board is redevelopment is out, sort of green space development is becoming the status quo. And that is happening all over Virginia. And like I said, we're starting to see that proposed in Maryland. There are some sites in Maryland that are not necessarily the case, but there are others that is certainly the model. Now, as I kind of talked about, 500,000 acres of solar energy. Data centers are inherently land hungry by being power hungry. For the most part, and this is definitely a positive, like let's not throw the whole tech industry under the bus here. Most big tech companies have expressed goals to be carbon neutral, some by as early as 2030, but all of them are largely in line, if not more so, with the Paris climate agreements. And so as a general thumb, the data center industry does at least have goals to be carbon neutral. We can get into whether or not their attempt to achieve carbon neutrality comes at the expense of everybody else's goals for carbon neutrality, but that's maybe a discussion for another time. I wanted to highlight this sort of solar farm. This is a 6,300 acre solar farm in the state of Virginia. It's the largest in the PJM territory by a lot. It's huge, as you can kind of tell by the pictures. I think admittedly, and probably rightfully so, faced some pushback at the time of development, but is currently operating smoothly and is kicking off a good amount of solar energy. This project, once again, to come to the defense of big tech, was paid for in part by Amazon, actually. So, some good things happening kind of on that front. This is 617 megawatts of power, at least according to sort of some of the sources I found. I think that there's some discrepancy out there, but generally think 6,000 acres, 600 megawatts is like a good rough, 1 megawatt for 10 acres. As Dave kind of pointed out, the new sort of standard model for data centers is 100 megawatts per building. You're starting to see campuses of 4 to 5 to 6 to 7 buildings per campus, 200, 300, 400 acres at a time. This amount of solar energy is one of those data center campuses. Virginia has 40 of those campuses planned. Quantum Loophole is a 1 gigawatt project on the low end. Dave put up a chart that had it pushing 2 gigawatts. I think some of that depends on who you ask and timeline and all kinds of other things. Point being, 10,000 acres of solar to meet that with clean energy alone. No offense to the state of Maryland. Maryland's going to get real small real quick when you start looking for a place to put 100,000 acres of solar. There's, of course, the water aspect of data centers. I really do think data centers kind of touch all of the issues that the environmental community works on in one way, shape, or form. Let's start with water quality. That's your standard, what you would think of when you build 10,000 acres across the state of Virginia of new industrial development. That's stormwater runoff from construction. Think the various violations that have happened in the state of Maryland as Quantum Loophole seeks to get fiber optic cables to their site. That's just like one aspect of this. Once a site is built, you also have your standard industrial pollution runoff, road salts, oil leaks from parking lots, lawn chemicals, pesticides, you kind of name it. Once again, we're talking about the conversion of hundreds, if not thousands of acres of green space into industrial land. That is going to inherently have some downstream impacts. Water quantity also comes into play here. I think it's very important. Some statistics, you know, if you Google how much water does a data center use, some will say as much as 1 million gallons a day. The answer is it really varies. As a general rule of thumb, a data center campus is probably in the area of 1 million gallons of water a day. So maybe one particular building is no longer using that much, but the answer is it's really technology dependent. It's definitely something to think about. It's something localities and local government should be thinking about, something the public should be thinking about. I really like this picture on the right because I think it kind of hammers this point home. We are seeing across the region, I think Maryland is probably still in a pretty significant drought. These are going to become season-long record droughts, or as we all know, are going to become more and more common as the climate changes. And so what we as an environmental organization are worried about is that we're going to see water quantity supplies particularly fluctuate, but have a lot lower lows. And if you buckle that or combine that, if you sort of combine these two issues together with increasing industrial demand, at some point, we're going to run out of water. And I think what we're seeing is there's no plan for this. This is not an issue that regional water authorities, local governments, state governments have ever had to think about before in this part of the world, right? But we're starting to see water shortages that are much more in tune with what you see in Arizona and Nevada. And that's something that our region is going to have to grapple with if we want to build data centers at this rate and are facing an increasingly volatile climate situation here in our region. Now, of course, how do we get power to data centers? The old model, as we all know, is power station, power lines, transmission lines to large load customer. That is why we have, you know, you can kind of see it on this map, the MPRP, the Maryland Piedmont Reliability Project, which is of course all in the news. Generally, when you think MPRP, think data centers in Northern Virginia. Of course, the developers in the data center industry are kind of trying to shirk out of that a little bit and say, well, it's kind of for broader grid reliability and maybe some economic development, i.e. data centers in Frederick and in Maryland. But for the most part, this is a $5.2 billion project that's benefiting the data center industry in Northern Virginia. I think more importantly, you can see sort of on the western edge on the left side of this map is what's called the Morrow Line. The Morrow Line isn't even trying to hide it. The Morrow Line is straight up coal-fired power plant to data center alley. And PJM is very clear. This is, we need more power from this coal-fired power plant, which was planned to be retired, and we need to get it to data centers as soon as possible. So as we're thinking about this, like this is this sort of growing question. Of course, there's air quality and the climate change impacts. I wanted to touch on diesel generators a little bit. All data centers, the industry-wide model across the board is backup power with diesel generators. The industry will tell you, well, these things never run. You know, maybe we test them occasionally, but it's nothing to worry about. There's no real air quality impacts. And to that, I call hooey. We're looking at, you know, in Virginia, at least 5,000 of these 3 megawatt diesel generators on the ground in the state of Virginia. Each one of these is getting tested at least once a month for about 2 hours a month, which is inherently significant impacts. You know, the standard industry model is about 20 hours a month. That's not insignificant when you've got 5,000 of them. That's a lot of air pollution. And more importantly, if there ever were a need to energize them, every single one of them would turn on automatically, right? And so what we're talking about here is the potential for serious localized air quality concerns in the event of a grid outage of any kind. And more importantly, I think what's a little bit scary about this is oftentimes we're talking about grid outages at a time when air quality is already low. So think like grid failure in the summertime because peak load is too high. And so all of these would turn on when we already have really bad air quality. And I think that's something that needs to be grappled with. As I think a lot of folks on this call know, These diesel generator complexes were supposed to be reviewed by Maryland's Public Service Commission and go through a CPCN process. The governor and the General Assembly last year changed that law, and now these basically have cursory minor air permit review from the state environmental agency and nothing else, which includes, which I think is the most frustrating part, it no longer includes a comprehensive overview of the environmental justice impacts of diesel generators. It no longer includes a comprehensive review of potential alternatives to diesel generators. And more importantly, it becomes a one-off cursory impact and there are no cumulative impact reviews occurring. And so that's a serious problem. Of course, data centers need a lot of energy, as we've touched on. At least in the short term, the electric utility model has been reliance on the same old natural gas and coal. We are seeing and have seen proposals for a continuation of coal into the immediate future in order for, quote, grid reliability. Dominion Energy in the state of Virginia is planning new natural gas. That's what electric utilities do. And Paige might talk about this in a little bit. Sierra Club in Virginia is very familiar with sort of how Dominion Energy, our local electric monopoly, operates. They are constantly going to fall back to the old ways, which is natural gas and coal. And so when an electric utility is faced with unprecedented load growth, that's what we're going to see, is new fossil fuel producing facilities. In those facilities, electric monopolies are going to rely on those for more than 25 years, right? Like if Dominion Energy and other electric utilities build natural gas facilities, they're not just going to say, all right, great, it's 2050, we're going to shut everything down. Those have a lifespan. They're going to run those well into the future, 40, 50 years at least. The last thing I wanted to touch on, I know this is a very controversial topic, is the idea of nuclear. Can we meet this with nuclear? I think it is worth noting that data center operators are talking about nuclear, utilities are talking about nuclear. I think the thing that I really wanted to make sure we hit on is this idea of co-location. So data centers locating next to nuclear energy, and what's happening, and this is why it's a huge problem, is data centers are locating next to existing nuclear generation. And they are buying that power at the source, which means all of that energy now has to be made up somewhere else on the grid. All the while, that tech company, Amazon, Microsoft, whoever, gets to claim carbon neutrality. That is just a zero carbon shell game. They get all of the benefits of carbon-free power and tell everybody else, y'all go figure it out on your own. And that is a real problem.
Great. Thank you, Kyle. We're going to try to regain a little bit of our time here and move on to Paige. And once Paige is done, we'll see how much time we have for Q&A before we move into our breakout rooms.
Awesome. Hey, everybody. Wow, we really heard for two awesome speakers today. I have the privilege of getting to work with Kyle a little bit. I'd like to work with Kyle more, but we're both so busy on data center work. He's very impressive, so that was great to listen to him. But yeah, I'd really like to get into the impacts of data centers. We've heard so much about these environmental impacts of these massive developments. And as Kyle said, in Virginia, we really understand the impacts of these developments, despite the lack of transparency that we've received, because we are the data center capital of the world. I think China comes behind us. It's Virginia and then China. So we have this epicenter of data centers here in our state. And as Kyle said, there are a lot of impacts to our environment, but also there are a lot of impacts to people. And that's really what I want to zone in on today. So let's just briefly go over some things that have been said already, and then some things that haven't been touched on as much. So as was explained, data centers are just massive buildings with a bunch of servers in them. And these servers, just as your laptop gets really, really hot, these are think about like a million of your laptops in a building. They require cooling. Like your laptop has a little fan in it. These data centers require a huge amount of cooling, millions of gallons of water a day sometimes, as Kyle said. So That's where the degradation of our water comes from. And then, of course, as Kyle said, the degradation to our land is because they also take up a huge amount of space. Multiple football fields worth of space sometimes. And then this other part of it, so now we have impacts to our land and water. And now on the people side, Kyle explained this really well. We have to, in Virginia specifically, Dominion, our utility, is proposing to build more fossil fuel plants in order to provide power for data centers. This will affect Maryland too, because we are on the same energy grid, which was referred to as PJM. That's basically just an electricity grid that goes to multiple states in the Southeast. Virginia and Maryland are on the same one, which means our energy is from the same sources essentially. And so if we're requiring to build more energy and our bills are going up because of it, that means your bills in Maryland are going to go up as well. Just something to link us together, not in the best way. But it's just a way to say, you know, this is happening not just in our state, but in your state too, because of the decisions that have been made in Virginia quickly and without a lot of transparency. And I'll get more in depth on why the increase to our bills is really happening. And the hint there is it's because of our monopoly called Dominion, which Kyle also mentioned. And then, yeah, we really are facing what we like to call the energy crisis, because that's what it is. We literally do not have the power in Virginia to power these data centers as they are currently proposed. We have hundreds of projects that are coming down the pipeline in Virginia. Dominion does not have the power to supply to them. If we didn't have data centers, let's be clear about this. If we didn't have any more data center development happening, we would be able to hit our clean energy goals in Virginia. Data centers are the only reason that we are having a rise in our electric bills. And by the way, that rise, our utility just came out and said our electric bills will be doubled. We know it will be more because they usually underestimate, but doubled by 2039 in Virginia because of data centers alone. So we literally do not have the power as is to power these projects that are coming in the pipeline. This was touched on as well, the increase to our air pollution. We're going to see these fossil fuel projects get built out and coal plants stay open only because of data centers. And I really want to talk about what the future of the data centers look like, because when we talk about them as they currently are, yes, they require a lot of power, but the new data centers that are coming down the line are AI data centers, which are strictly for AI needs, and they require so much more energy, so much more water. And we have an estimate of 3 to 10 times more the amount of energy of old data centers. Sorry, I did not put that correctly on the slide, but it's a lot, and it's a lot to take in, because we really, since we don't truly know what those impacts will be, that these are estimates at this point. You know, we're already looking at an energy crisis, and we don't have that transparency piece yet. So that is something to note, that this could be even more than we even think it is. Which is wild to think about the effects to our environment and to people's electricity bills, especially if we end up paying for it, which it looks like we are. And in Virginia, we have not had any substantial policy passed. We haven't had any safeguards put in place for people when it comes to data center development. That has led, I saw one of the questions in the chat asking, you know, how did Virginia get to where it is? How did you get to so many data centers in your state? This is part of the reason, because we didn't have anything to stop them and to require them to go through the decision-making processes that they should have gone through. They should have been treated as fossil fuel projects, and they all should go through public comment periods, but they don't, because of things like by right development, where they can change to industrial zoning, and then they don't have to be brought to the public to be approved. So that's really what happened, is these data centers came to localities. They promised local tax revenue, which, especially in rural counties, we just haven't seen yet. Maybe in Northern Virginia more, but I can talk about that. But yeah, they make these promises, and then the localities don't ask questions, they approve these projects, and then we are forced to, now we're in a place where we're forced to foot the bill for hundreds of projects that have been approved across the state and hundreds that have already been built. So let's talk more about the price, because especially on the pollution piece, as we know, pollution doesn't stay in one place. So this is happening to all of us, not just Virginia. One of the things that we always talk about in Virginia, just as an example, is the Chesterfield gas plant. So Kyle mentioned Dominion is approving and proposing the build of this fleet of fossil fuel plants. They have already started this, and one of those plants is called the Chesterfield gas plant. Now, what do we know about fossil fuel plants historically in Virginia, but across the nation, is that they are placed in Black and brown communities and low-income communities. So now Chesterfield gas plant is an environmental justice community. We have a community that has already been targeted unfairly by pollution historically, being affected by data center development alone because of this Chesterfield gas plant that's being proposed. And the community has been fighting it, and it's been ongoing for a long time now. But that is just a good example of kind of what we're looking at towards the future of this fossil fuel development. And I think this was mentioned too, but we are having to keep coal plants open only because of this development and because of this energy demand. We have coal plants that are staying open in Virginia. You have coal plants that are staying open in Maryland. We're looking at coal plants that are staying open in West Virginia. And I think this is a good time to make a connection to the coal industry here. There is no development that really mimics the power, the land, the water demand of data centers. They are in a league of their own. The only similarities that I can really see are these localities relying on one source of income, that is the data centers, for their tax revenue. Reminds me of the coal going into local economies and leaving them in a very vulnerable place. And so that is what we are afraid of in Virginia. We are afraid of these data centers coming in, being their only source of local revenue. And again, they are not required to stay. They have no obligation to remain in a locality and provide for that local revenue, tax revenue. And so that's something that we think about, and that's something to be scared of, is that imitation of those two industries. And then just the infrastructure build out overall. So in Virginia, because we are a utility monopoly with Dominion, Dominion has written it into law that we pay 100% of the costs of their fossil fuel build out. So if they build a gas plant that costs $2 billion, that cost gets passed on to all of our electric bills. And that is how we are paying for this data center build out. I don't know about you all, but I do not think it's fair, and we've seen this in other states, I do not think it's fair for people to have to pay for the energy demand for one industry, especially a $1 billion industry that could easily afford their own energy infrastructure. And then Kyle touched on this too, but the other cost that we're really seeing to people is the diesel generators. As Kyle said, they can have thousands of generators on site. In Fairfax County in Virginia, there was an Amazon data center, and the data center was right here, and then the community was literally right next to it. They doubled their diesel generators that they were having. They didn't have to go through public comment process for it because it was by right and already approved. So now we're looking at thousands of diesel generators right next to a community. That really connects to this transparency piece. It's already alarming that they would be testing those generators next to where children are playing. But we don't know, like Kyle said, how often they're testing them. And they're not required to tell us. I read one application in Virginia that said, it was just what the data center was allowed to do and what they had requested to do, whatever. And on it, it basically said, We are operating our diesel generators only between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. during the weekdays. That's a huge amount of time to be able to test your diesel generators. And not only that, but I spoke to someone recently who is really just a massive part of this work. It's Julie Boldhouse. She's incredible. She works for the Piedmont Environmental Council. She was telling me that the diesel generators have to be tested a lot of the time, one at a time. And so by the time you get to that last diesel generator, you pretty much have to start over. So I'm not sure how much of a break there really is, depending on the data center, but that's a reality that we could be looking at right next to people's homes and right next to where children play. And as we know, diesel pollution is no joke. That's PM 2.5. That's that tiny pollution that you can't see that's linked to higher rates of breast cancer and lung cancer. There's arsenic and benzene in diesel pollution. And so this is a very real issue that we have not had the transparency on in Virginia and in Maryland. And it's unfair to the communities that these data centers are being developed in. So I know I talked about this a little bit before, but just to get into it more, the way that these data centers are benefiting from this is egregious. We had a meeting with Google because Google got scared because we were publicly bringing up this information, and we were right. We were saying data centers are coming into states. They are not paying their fair share. We are footing the bill for them for energy infrastructure, and we are having health costs because of it. And Google came to us and said, hey, we'd love to talk about this. And we said, hey, do you think that you could run your diesel generators? Instead, you could use backup battery power, backup battery storage, which is way better for people's health. And we know that they can afford to do this. And instead of having a conversation about it, they're a business. And so they looked at us and said, what's the business argument for us doing that? And we said, is children's health not enough? So we're at a place here where, especially going into the lawmaking session, we're going to have to figure out ways to make sure that they are held accountable for the pollution that they are causing in our state. And as we know, pollution doesn't stay in one place, so in our nation. But yeah, we pay them in so many different ways. We pay them for their services already. I love Amazon Prime, I'm not gonna lie. I love Amazon Prime, but I'm already paying for that. And then we're paying for them on our electric bills, as I've already said. New fossil fuel energy infrastructure, a whole fleet of fossil fuel energy infrastructure across our state. In Virginia, we pay 100% of those costs. And then they get state tax benefits. I know Dave mentioned this, that you all are having this come down the pipeline in Maryland. Georgia actually suspended the tax subsidies that we provide in Virginia because they cited what's happening in our state. And it is an incentive, and it is a reason why data centers love to come here. And it's because we provide those benefits for them. So there's so many different ways that we as people and as the state already pay them, that we really need to be transparent about, and we really need to hold people accountable on. And something that I'm sure Maryland is dealing with too is the affordability of just living. In Virginia, 29% of our families had to choose between paying for basic goods and their electricity bill in 2023. Again, I'd like to talk about how if we didn't have data center development, we wouldn't need new energy infrastructure, and we wouldn't be seeing a doubling, which is an underestimate, in our electric bills by 2039. And we really, really feel that Virginia's families should not be forced to foot the bill. And we don't believe that Maryland should not be forced to foot the bill for the world's internet access. It's unfair. We're talking about an issue of fairness. And then I talked about this being cited in EJ communities and how this is really a justice issue. Chesterfield is just the first example. I'm sure you all have seen this in Maryland. We had another example in Pittsylvania County, which is a low-income, poorer, mostly Black community who has already been targeted with multiple gas plant proposals and multiple gas plants. Recently, they did have a win. but they were still targeted by a data center that had a natural gas plant on site. The Board of Supervisors listened to the community, and actually they won that, and the applicant pulled their application. But we know we will continue to see this. We will continue to see our most vulnerable communities targeted by this problem, which means data centers and big tech companies are the reason that children have to play next to a gas plant in their neighborhood. And just because, like Kyle was talking about, just because you have solar on site, or maybe because Google said, hey, we're going to purchase solar in Arizona so that we're clean energy, we're going to use that to offset our pollution. That doesn't offset the real impacts that are happening in our state. That doesn't let you get away with the real impacts that are happening in our state. And of course, that are happening to states that are seeing this development too. And then I know Kyle has talked on nuclear too. Something that I'm sure you all will hear about, if you haven't already, we are hearing it more and more in Virginia. These small modular nuclear reactors, they haven't worked yet. They're unproven technology, and they're really, really expensive. And it's something that we are really looking at because it will end up on our electric bill. Just the investment in developing or looking into developing them. So it's something that we're watching, and it's just another way that we are bearing the cost of this build out, and we predict we will be bearing the cost of this build out. And then let's see where I am on time. I'm definitely going over, but that's okay. This is important. The other thing I wanted to talk about that's an important piece of this is in Virginia, we have private contracts between data centers and our state utility. So if you are a data center and you come to Virginia and you've been approved to develop, you sign a private contract with our state utility about what energy rates you have or what energy rates you want. So now we have big tech companies having private contracts with our utility while the rest of us have to foot the bill for their energy infrastructure. And we don't know what those rates are. They could be extremely low rates. So it's something that, another way that we are being taken advantage of, and another way that this data center issue is an issue of fairness. And then, yeah, I mean, the thing I talked about before with diesel generators, we know that they can afford it. But we have, these are big tech companies who generated more than 100 billion worth of revenue, or are estimated to generate more than 100 billion worth of revenue. And yeah, as I've said, this is a little bit repetitive, but I just think it's so important to talk about, is that we are facing a reality where data centers are the only reason that polluters are building new fossil fuel plants. Data centers are the only reason that we're keeping coal plants open in Virginia. Data centers are the only reason we're keeping coal plants open in Maryland, in West Virginia. And we really think it's time that they take responsibility. Yeah, I've said all of this. Just want to make sure. Yeah, said all of this. So I want to end on a high note because I know that was so much doom and gloom. And I feel like we're in the trenches in Virginia. So it's important to note that, yes, data center development has come at the cost of people in our environment. And yes, we have an uphill battle, and it's been difficult, but we still have wins that we've been seeing. Like I talked about in Pennsylvania, the applicant pulled their application. Recently in Henrico, Virginia, an applicant pulled their application because the local planning commission recommended that they don't pass this project. Recently, our state made our diesel generator information public because we have been so vocal about the lack of transparency from our state. Google has been requesting meetings with us. That's a win. They're scared. We know they're scared because we put public pressure on. When we make them look bad in the public arena, they come to you to have a conversation. That is a good sign that they're reaching out. Then they've reached out twice now. And they've really gone on the defense. They have been sending out more targeted ads. They've been trying to spread misinformation about data center development, which that is unfortunate, but it is a sign that we're doing the right thing. And then we've had localities pass pretty significant best practices for data center development. A locality did that, and that was Fairfax. So I would just recommend, especially in Maryland, as you see more development, that the local action is going to be one of the more important places that you'll see some wins. So there is hope, and that's the note that I would love to end on. So thank you all.
Wow, thank you so much, Paige. That was an eye opener, and I saw lots of chatter in the chat. Before we go on to some Q&A, I do want to take a moment to recognize a few of our elected officials that are here in the room so they can hear from us full hand. I see that we have John Sheridan from Councilwoman Jolene Ivy's office being represented here. We have Mayor Noah Waters and Vice Mayor Josie Gomez of the City of District Heights. So I do want to start with a pretty simple question and then move on to some of the questions that we have in the chat here. If we could possibly address how complicit, I heard you mention Amazon. A lot of us love Amazon, right? But do you know on average how complicit the average homeowner is in the demand for data center usage? And could you possibly give 3 action steps that households could take that would help reduce our demand on data centers?
I actually really love this question. And the reason I love this question is because I think this is the same as Exxon telling everybody that if we would just turn off our lights, we could solve climate change. And that's like, it's just inherently not true. It's up to corporations to kind of tackle these difficult questions. As Paige kind of pointed out, like we're kind of collectively dealing with the largest conglomerate of public or of wealth that has kind of ever existed, right? Like we're dealing with the richest, the combination of the richest corporations that have ever lived. I don't think it's up to everyday Americans to figure out how to better manage their data to hopefully solve this problem. If you did want to be better sort of tech stewards, artificial intelligence is extremely energy demanding. And so I would recommend only using AI platforms, ChatGPT and the things only under like really, really necessary platforms. Like you can go to AI various platforms and ask it to do like ridiculous things that don't mean anything. So be cognizant of like just the fact that when you are asking one of the various AI platforms to do something that has consequences on the back end. And then of course, everybody could be a little bit better about data management. You know, and I am certainly guilty of this. I am sure somewhere on the cloud, I have college papers that I don't need anymore. So but I really return home to that point, which is it's up to these large multi-billion-dollar corporations to figure out how to solve this problem and not us.
Paige, Dave, do you want to add to
Yeah, I really love what Kyle said. I totally agree that it's on them to figure it out. And also something that's interesting about AI data centers. So most of the energy demand and this crisis that we're looking at in Virginia specifically is because of the AI data centers that are coming down the line. And something I learned recently because we were part of an AI tech conference is that the AI that we are currently using, they are using our information as they're testing and learning. So we are essentially doing the work for them to grow that technology. And that's just an important thing to take into account is not only are we paying for their energy, but we're also expanding their product for them the more that we use it. And that's not to say don't use it because, you know, ChatGPT is a friend of mine. But yeah, it's just something to take note of that, you know, it's just another way that we're playing a part without this transparency and without our full participation of that happening. We didn't agree to be their test dummies, but yeah, I really enjoy what Kyle said about it too.
And the only thing that I would add is if you could turn off AI searches whenever possible. You know, nowadays they kind of come up by default. So if you can turn them off, Google automatically by default is giving you an AI search whenever you search for something. You can actually work on turning things like that off. And if you can, do it, because the normal search works just fine and uses 10 times less electricity.
Our last question before we move into some breakout, could you speak a little bit about the experience in Virginia in terms of what's happening in rural communities specifically, especially since communities are expected to take on the cost of these facilities? And could you cite some specific examples if you have them?
I recently spoke in Mecklenburg County, Virginia, which is a rural area in Virginia, south of Richmond. And they are specifically being targeted by Microsoft. So the majority, if not all of the data centers, which is a large amount for one small rural locality, are Microsoft data centers. When I spoke to this community, they had little to no knowledge about the projects that were currently in their locality. There's really not a lot of information you can find out about each individual Microsoft project, except for really where they're located. We managed to find out about their diesel generators recently because of that, Virginia releasing that information. And I think in Mecklenburg County alone, there's 750 diesel generators that we know of right now. So that's a small rural area. That's a lot for that area. We're not talking about Loudon. We're talking about a pretty small, like beautiful farm area. And the other thing that I heard from the community was this concern about the transmission lines and the substations. So a lot of their, farmland that's been in their family for generations is being cut through with massive substations and massive transmission lines. And the transmission lines a lot of the time are, there doesn't have to be a lot of conversation between Dominion and the landowner. The substations are a different story, but it's a lot of their land they're seeing be lost, and there's not a lot of transparency from Microsoft.
Thank you, everyone. And
Send
with
your
that,
notes.
we are done with EJNU and data centers for today. So thank you again.